The champagne tasted like failure. Isabella held the flute with fingers that felt disconnected from her own hand. Around her, the Grand Astoria Hotel ballroom was a sea of polite laughter and the scent of 1,000 lilies. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto men in sharp tuxedos and women in dresses that cost more than her car. The low hum of the string quartet was a constant, soothing noise meant to disguise the frantic social climbing happening in every corner. She had practiced her smile in the mirror for an hour before coming, a placid expression she hoped conveyed effortless confidence. It now felt like a mask made of cracking plaster. She was here to prove a point, to prove that Ethan's decision to end their 2-year relationship had not broken her, to prove she could stand in the same room as him and his wealthy family and feel nothing but polite indifference. But every note from the violins, every burst of laughter, felt like a judgment. Her dress, a deep emerald silk she had spent too much on, suddenly felt cheap. She saw him across the room, his blonde hair catching the light as he laughed with the groom. He looked like a prince from a storybook. He always did. That was his greatest trick. A sudden sharp clinking of a glass against a microphone cut through the chatter. The quartet quieted. A wave of dread, cold and immediate, washed over Isabella. Ethan was walking towards the stage, a microphone in his hand. His smile was wide and charming, aimed at the bride and groom who beamed back at him. But Isabella knew that smile. She had seen it 1,000 times, right before he said something designed to cut her down to size in private. She had just never imagined he would do it in front of 300 people. "If I could have everyone's attention," Ethan began, his voice smooth as velvet. "For those who don't know me, I'm Ethan Hayes, and Thomas has been my best friend since we were learning to kick a football instead of studying." A wave of fond laughter rippled through the crowd. Isabella's hands tightened around her glass. Her knuckles were white. She forced herself to breathe. He was just giving a toast. A normal, predictable, best man's toast. "I've watched Thomas fall in love a few times," Ethan continued, his eyes scanning the room. "But watching him fall in love with Sarah was different. It was real. It taught me a lot about what matters. It taught me about finding the person who fits you perfectly, who makes you better." He paused, letting the sentiment hang in the air, and then his eyes found her. Across the sprawling ballroom, through the haze of candlelight and perfume, his gaze locked onto hers. The charming smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by something sharp and cruel. "It also teaches you what you don't want," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, as if he were sharing a secret with everyone. "Sometimes you have to learn the hard way. You might think you found something special, something you can build a life with." The room was silent now. The air grew thick and heavy. Isabella could feel the shift, the collective lean-in of a crowd sensing drama. Her heart began to beat a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. "Please," she thought, her prayer a silent scream in her mind. "Please don't." "You might share your deepest secrets with someone," Ethan went on, his gaze still pinned on her. "You might listen to their little dreams, dreams of opening a tiny, dusty bookstore in some forgotten small town. You might even find it quaint, charming even." A hot flush crept up Isabella's neck. It was her dream, a secret she had whispered to him one night, curled up on his sofa, feeling safe. A dream he had called beautiful. Now he said the words "dusty bookstore" with a sneer that dripped with condescension. "But then you realize," he said, raising his voice again, projecting to the back of the room, "that quaint doesn't build an empire. Quaint doesn't get you a seat at the table. You realize you need a partner, not a project." He raised his glass. "So here's to Sarah and Thomas, for showing us all what real partnership, real ambition, looks like. May you never settle for less." The applause was scattered and uncertain. A few people clapped politely, most just stared, their eyes darting between a smirking Ethan and a frozen Isabella. The humiliation was a physical force. It pressed down on her chest, sealing her breath. It was a white-hot light that left her exposed, her most vulnerable, gentle dream dissected and mocked for sport. The room began to spin. The faces of strangers swam before her, their expressions a blur of pity and morbid curiosity. She could hear a woman near her whisper to her husband, "Oh, that's the girl he just broke up with." How awful. She couldn't stay. She couldn't breathe. With a choked gasp, she pushed her chair back. It scraped loudly against the polished floor, the sound unnaturally sharp in the lingering silence. She didn't look at anyone. She just turned and walked, her legs unsteady. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Not here. Not in front of them. She focused on the grand, ornate doors at the far end of the ballroom, a gateway to escape. Each step felt like wading through mud. The sympathetic stares were worse than the mocking ones. They felt like tiny needles all over her skin. She reached the exit, her hand fumbling for the cold brass handle. Just before she could pull it open and flee into the anonymity of the hotel corridor, a strange impulse made her look back. One last look at the wreckage. Her eyes swept across the room, past the gossiping tables, past the bride who looked horrified, past Ethan who was now accepting a pat on the back from a friend, a conquering hero. And then her gaze stopped. In a shadowed alcove, at a table set for one, a man sat watching her. He had been watching her the entire time. She recognized him instantly from newspaper articles and whispered rumors. Damian Blackwood, a man whose name was synonymous with power, wealth, and a terrifying ruthlessness that was the stuff of legend. He was impeccably dressed in a black suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. His features were sharp, his dark hair slicked back. A faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, the only imperfect detail on a face that was otherwise dangerously handsome. He was not looking at Ethan. He was looking directly at her. His expression was not one of pity. There was no sympathy in his dark, piercing eyes. There was only a cold, unnerving intensity, an analytical stillness. It felt as if he had not just witnessed her humiliation, but had dissected it, understood its weight, and filed it away. He saw her pain, her shame, her rage, and he did not flinch. He did not look away. In that moment, the noisy, crowded ballroom faded into nothing. There was only the silent, unblinking gaze of the most dangerous man in the city. Isabella's hand froze on the doorknob. The cold metal was a grounding sensation. She could leave. She could run home, crawl into bed, and let the shame consume her. She could let Ethan have this victory, let him sleep soundly, drunk on his own cruelty, while her world fell apart. The image of his smug face flashed in her mind, the sound of his friend's laughter, the memory of her secret dream, once a source of comfort, now a weapon he had used against her. Something inside her snapped. The despair, the shame, the hurt, it all caught fire. It burned away the tears and solidified into something hard and sharp. Rage. A pure, primal rage that demanded an answer. An eye for an eye. He had tried to reduce her to nothing, a pathetic footnote in his grand life story. She would not let him. She let go of the door. She turned around and began to walk back into the lion's den. The whispers followed her as she moved. Where is she going now? What is she doing? She didn't hear them. The blood was pounding in her ears, a drumbeat of purpose. Her path was a straight line, cutting directly through the tables, towards the shadowed alcove, towards him. Her borrowed dress felt like armor now. Her trembling had stopped, replaced by a strange, terrifying calm. She could feel Damian Blackwood's eyes on her with every step she took. He did not seem surprised. He watched her approach as if he had been expecting it. She stopped at his table. The scent of his cologne, something dark and expensive like leather and spice, reached her. He was larger up close, his presence filling the space. He gestured with one long-fingered hand toward the empty chair across from him, an unspoken invitation. Isabella did not sit. She stood over him, a supplicant before a dark king. The tears had dried on her cheeks, leaving salty tracks. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and trembled with the force of her fury. "You saw what he did," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Damian Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her face. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The movement was slow, deliberate. The words felt like swallowing glass, but she forced them out. The name was poison on her tongue. "His name is Ethan Hayes." She took a ragged breath, the finality of what she was about to do settling in her soul. She was stepping off a cliff into an abyss she could not see the bottom of. "I want you to help me." Her voice dropped to a whisper, raw and desperate. I want you to destroy him. Silence. The string quartet began to play again, a soft melody that was a world away from the ugly transaction taking place in the shadows. Damien looked at her for a long, heavy moment. His eyes were like black ice, and she felt he could see every broken piece of her. He was not looking at a woman scorned. He was looking at an opportunity, a tool, a new interesting possession. Then the corner of his mouth lifted. It was not a smile. It was the slow, chilling curve of a predator that has just seen its prey walk willingly into a trap. It was a look of absolute control. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He moved with an unhurried grace that was mesmerizing. He withdrew a small, rectangular card. It was made of a thick black cardstock that felt heavy and important even from a distance. There was no name, no company logo, no phone number, just a single line of text, an address embossed in subtle silver lettering. He held it out to her. Her fingers, which were now shaking again, closed around the card. It was cool and smooth to the touch, a stark contrast to the fire in her veins. He leaned forward, his voice a low, intimate murmur that slid past her defenses and coiled in her ear. It was a sound that promised both salvation and ruin. "Be there tomorrow at noon," Damien Blackwood said, his gaze pinning her in place. "Your old life is over." The address on the card was not a house. It was a monolith of black glass and steel that clawed at the sky. Isabella stood across the street, the morning sun glinting off its surface, making it look like a shard of obsidian. The paper felt thin and fragile in her trembling hand, a stark contrast to the building's brutal permanence. A part of her wanted to tear it up, to run and never look back. But where would she run? Back to the pitying looks of her friends? Back to the life Ethan had so gleefully shattered in front of 200 people? No, her old life was over. Damien Blackwood had said so himself. His voice, a low murmur in the chaos of the wedding, had been the only solid thing to hold on to. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic bird beating against her ribs, she crossed the street. The lobby was a cathedral of silence and white marble. The air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone, clean to the point of being sterile. A man in a severe black suit stood behind a desk that looked like a block of polished granite. He didn't ask for her name. He simply looked at her, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Mr. Blackwood is expecting you," he said, his voice as colorless as the room. He gestured toward a private elevator set apart from the main bank. The ride-up was silent and unnervingly smooth. There were no buttons to press. The elevator simply moved, sealing her inside a mirrored box that reflected 1,000 versions of a pale, frightened girl. She watched her own wide hazel eyes, the faint spray of freckles across her nose that she'd always hated, the way her hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists. The doors slid open without a sound, not into a hallway, but directly into the penthouse. Isabella stepped out and forgot to breathe. It was less a home and more a statement. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire space, showcasing a dizzying panoramic view of the city below. The sky was a brilliant, endless blue, and the world seemed to be laid out at her feet. But inside, there was no color. The floors were black marble. The sparse, angular furniture was dark wood and chrome. The walls were a stark, empty white. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter. Not a single object seemed out of place. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled hum of the city far below. It was the most beautiful, lonely place she had ever seen. "Do you like the view?" His voice came from behind her, and she jumped, spinning around. Damien Blackwood stood in the archway of a room she hadn't noticed. He was dressed in a dark gray suit that fit him perfectly, his black hair slicked back. The faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow seemed more pronounced in the sharp morning light. He wasn't smiling. His expression was one of cool, detached assessment, like a collector examining a new acquisition. "It's a lot," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Her heart hammered against her chest. He was different here in his own space. At the wedding, he had been a shadow. Here, he was the gravity that held this entire empty universe together. He walked towards her, his expensive shoes making soft, deliberate clicks on the marble floor. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. His dark eyes moved from her face down to her neck, then back up. "You look terrified, Isabella," he said, his voice a low, calm timbre. "There is no need. No one can hurt you here." She wanted to believe him. A part of her, the part that had been flayed open by Ethan's cruelty, desperately wanted this to be a sanctuary. But another, more instinctual part of her felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He gestured to a large walk-in closet. "I had some things brought for you. They should be your size." Inside, racks were filled with new clothes, silks, cashmeres, and linens in a palette of muted grays, blacks, and creams. There was not a single bright color. It was a wardrobe for a ghost. Thank you," she stammered, overwhelmed. "You didn't have to do all this." "It's done," he said simply, as if discussing a minor business transaction. He turned away and walked over to a small, lacquered box on a steel table. He opened it. "I do, however, have one more thing for you." He turned back, and in his hand lay a necklace. It was a delicate platinum chain, but suspended from it was a single pear-cut black diamond. It was exquisite, unlike anything she had ever seen. It didn't sparkle. Instead, it seemed to drink the light from the room, a tiny, perfect drop of night. "It's beautiful," she breathed, mesmerized by its dark heart. "Come here." It was not a request. He gestured to the space in front of him. Hesitantly, she took a step closer. He lifted the necklace. "Turn around." She obeyed, her back to him, her skin prickling with a strange mix of fear and anticipation. She felt the cold whisper of the platinum chain as he draped it around her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin as he worked the clasp. They were cool and steady. For a fleeting second, she felt his breath on her neck. A shiver traced its way down her spine. The clasp clicked shut. The sound was deafening in the silent room. She turned back to face him, her hand instinctively rising to touch the diamond. It was cold against her warm skin, and heavier than it looked. A beautiful weight. "It suits you," Damien said, his eyes fixed on the stone at the base of her throat. "A reminder of our arrangement." He looked from the necklace to her eyes. "You belong to me now, Isabella, and I protect what is mine." The words hung in the air, a promise and a threat entwined. He didn't wait for a reply. He simply turned and walked toward a home office, the glass doors sliding shut behind him, leaving her alone in the vast, silent living room, with the city sprawling beneath her and a cold diamond resting against her pulse. The first few days were a blur of disorienting luxury. She ate meals that were prepared by a silent chef and left for her on the massive dining table. She slept in a bed with sheets so soft they felt like water. She wandered the vast, empty rooms of the penthouse, feeling like a visitor in a museum. She found a state-of-the-art entertainment system and a tablet connected to the internet. It was through that tablet, on the third day that she saw it, she was scrolling through a major news site, the habit a lingering ghost of her old life. And then a headline made her stop. "Hayes International deal collapses, sending shockwaves through market." Her breath caught. She clicked on the article. A multi-billion-dollar merger, one that Ethan's father had been working on for over a year, had inexplicably fallen apart at the last minute. The European consortium had pulled out, citing sudden and unforeseen due diligence concerns. The article mentioned rumors of a scandal, of damaging information being leaked. Hayes International's stock was in freefall. They were facing a catastrophic financial crisis. Isabella stared at the screen, her blood running cold and hot at the same time. She read the words again. Unforeseen concerns, damaging information. It was him. It had to be Damien. He had done this, so quickly, so quietly, so completely. A wicked, thrilling spike of satisfaction shot through her. She thought of Ethan's smug, handsome face at the wedding, the way his voice had dripped with contempt as he tore her apart. He wasn't smiling now. His perfect, privileged world was crumbling, and it was because of her. She had asked for this. She had wanted this. The feeling was heady, a dark and powerful rush. She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city. The victory felt immense. It was a shield, a balm on the raw wound of her humiliation. For the first time since that night, she felt a sense of power. Protected. Vindicated. Damien had kept his promise. He was destroying Ethan Hayes. But as the initial rush faded, a different feeling began to creep in. An unease that settled deep in her stomach. The sheer scale of it was terrifying. This wasn't just a prank or a social embarrassment. This was the systematic destruction of an entire family's legacy, done in less than 72 hours. All because she had asked. The power that had felt so thrilling a moment ago now seemed monstrous. What kind of man could topple an empire with a whisper? The thought was deeply unsettling. The penthouse, which had started to feel like a strange sort of haven, suddenly felt different. The silence was heavier. The clean lines of the furniture seemed sharper, more menacing. She felt a sudden, desperate need for something normal, something real. She needed to hear a familiar voice. She picked up her phone, the one she'd brought with her from her old life, and dialed her sister. "Sarah?" she said, her voice thick with emotion when her sister answered. "Izzy, oh my God, where have you been? I've been so worried. Are you okay after the wedding and what Ethan did?" Sarah's voice was a torrent of love and concern, and Isabella felt tears spring to her eyes. It was the first truly warm, genuine thing she had felt in days. "I'm okay, Sarah. I'm okay," she lied, sinking onto a cold leather sofa. "Listen, can we meet? For coffee? Please? I really need to see you." "Of course, anything. Where are you? Name the place. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Isabella's mind raced. A normal place? A coffee shop they both loved, halfway between their apartments. A place with worn wooden tables and the smell of roasted coffee beans and pastry, a piece of her old life. "How about the daily grind on Elm Street? In an hour?" "Perfect. I'll see you there, Izzy. I love you." "I love you too," Isabella whispered, and hung up. For the first time, a genuine smile touched her lips. For an hour, she could pretend. She could sit with her sister and talk about nothing and everything, and feel like Isabella Rossi again. Not some strange, kept creature in a glass tower. She went to the closet and ignored the racks of muted, expensive clothes Damien had provided. She found the simple jeans and soft blue sweater she had arrived in. They felt like her own skin. She pulled her hair back, slipped on her worn sneakers, and grabbed her purse. Walking towards the front door, she felt a lightness she hadn't realized she'd lost. Freedom was just an elevator ride away. As she reached for the handle of the large, featureless door, a figure stepped into her path. It was one of Damien's men, the same one who had often stood silently by the elevator. He was large and broad-shouldered, dressed in the same impeccable black suit. He had been so quiet she hadn't even known he was there. "Can I help you, Miss Rossi?" he asked. His voice was polite, even, with no discernible emotion. "Oh, I'm just going out," she said, trying to sound casual, her hand still hovering near the door. "I'm meeting my sister for coffee." The man did not move. He remained planted in front of the door, an immovable object. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," he said, his tone still perfectly level. Isabella's smile faltered. "What? Why not? It's just for an hour." "Mr. Blackwood's instructions are very clear," the bodyguard said, his eyes meeting hers. They were flat, empty of apology or malice. "He insists that you remain here, for your own safety." The words hit her like a physical blow. For her own safety, the same reason Damien had given for everything. The beautiful prison, the cold diamond. "My safety? From what? I'm going to a coffee shop 2 miles from here." Her voice rose slightly, a note of panic creeping in. "This is ridiculous. I'm leaving." She tried to step around him. He didn't touch her. He simply shifted his body, subtly but effectively blocking her path again. "I cannot let you leave, Miss Rossi," he repeated, his voice unchanged. It was the calm, unarguable finality that terrified her most. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a declaration. "Are you telling me I'm a prisoner?" she asked, her voice trembling now with a mixture of disbelief and fury. The bodyguard's expression remained placid. "Mr. Blackwood is simply ensuring your well-being. He will be back this evening. You can speak with him then." He then took a small step back, resuming his post by the wall, as if the conversation was over. As if she had already accepted her fate, Isabella stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the door that would not open for her, the promise of coffee with her sister, the brief sunlit mirage of normalcy evaporated into dust. The victory she had felt over Ethan turned to ash in her mouth. What good was his ruin if she wasn't free to see it? Slowly, she backed away from the door, her sneakers silent on the vast marble floor. She walked back to the center of the enormous living room. The city lights were beginning to flicker on as dusk approached, a billion points of life in a world she was no longer a part of. The penthouse was no longer a sanctuary. The stunning view was no longer a gift. Isabella looked out at the sprawling metropolis, at the cars moving like blood cells through the arteries of the streets, at the buildings full of people living their ordinary free lives. Her hand rose to her throat, her fingers closing around the black diamond. It was cold, so cold. The floor-to-ceiling windows didn't feel like windows anymore. They felt like the bars of a cage, a beautiful, glittering cage high above the world, and she was trapped inside. She was a prisoner. The news of Ethan's downfall came not as a single clap of thunder, but as a slow, relentless rain. Each morning, Isabella would wake in the silent, sun-drenched penthouse and find the reports waiting on a tablet beside her breakfast. The device was another of Damien's gifts, sleek and cold to the touch. The stories it displayed were anything but. At first, it was a whisper, a gossip column piece about Ethan Hayes being seen at an illegal high-stakes poker game. The accompanying photo showed him looking flushed and arrogant, a stack of chips before him. Isabella felt a small, dark thrill. It was the beginning. She had wanted him to feel the sting of public shame, and this was it. A few days later, the whisper became a shout. A major financial journal reported that Ethan had leveraged family assets to cover enormous gambling debts. The article was detailed, citing anonymous sources close to the Hayes Corporation. It spoke of panicked investors and a sudden, sharp drop in stock value. This time the thrill was gone. A cold knot formed in Isabella's stomach. She had imagined Ethan on his knees, begging for her forgiveness. She had not imagined the collapse of a company that employed thousands of people. She had not pictured his father, a man she had once respected, facing a board of furious shareholders. Damien moved through the penthouse with the quiet confidence of a man who owned the world itself. He would find her staring at the screen, her coffee untouched, and place a hand on her shoulder. His touch was always light, yet it felt heavy, a reminder of their arrangement. He never asked what she was reading. He already knew. He was the author of this slow, meticulous destruction. One morning, as she read about a charity, his mother's proudest achievement, being investigated for embezzlement, Damien spoke. His voice was a low murmur against the backdrop of the silent apartment. "Inconvenient," he said, looking over her shoulder at the headline. "Reputations are so fragile, like glass." He said it with the same casual tone someone might use to comment on the weather. Isabella looked up at him, into his dark, unreadable eyes. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him this was too much. This was not what she asked for. She had wanted a lesson, not an execution, but the words caught in her throat. What had she expected? She had walked up to the most dangerous man in the city and handed him a weapon. She could not now complain about how he chose to wield it. He was not a scalpel for precise surgery. He was a landslide, and he was burying Ethan, his family, and everything they had ever built. The revenge she had craved now tasted like ash in her mouth. Each news alert felt like another stone being laid on her own tomb. She was getting what she wanted, and it was destroying her. The black diamond at her throat felt colder each day, a tiny dark star absorbing all the light from her world. The penthouse was a world unto itself, a fortress of glass and steel suspended above the city. Most of its rooms were a mystery to Isabella. Damien had told her she was free to go anywhere she pleased within its walls, but she rarely strayed from the main living area and her bedroom. It felt like tempting fate, like a mouse exploring the wider cage. One afternoon, the oppressive silence was broken by the low murmur of voices from Damien's study. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. She had been on her way to the small library at the end of the hall, seeking a distraction in a book. She froze when she heard Damien's voice, as calm and even as ever, but with an underlying edge that made the hairs on her arms stand up. You were given a simple task, Damien said. The words were not loud, but they filled the space. One simple task, and you failed. Isabella felt an inexplicable pull, a morbid curiosity that overrode her fear. She crept closer, her bare feet making no sound on the polished marble floor. She peered through the narrow gap. A man she vaguely recognized as one of Damien's younger associates was standing before the large mahogany desk. He was trembling, his face pale and slick with sweat. His gaze was fixed on the floor, unable to meet Damien's eyes. Damien was sitting calmly in his leather chair, his hands steepled before him. He looked like a king passing a casual judgment. Mr. Blackwood, I swear it won't happen again, the man stammered, his voice cracking. There was a complication, a delay I couldn't foresee. Damien was silent for a long moment. He unlaced his fingers and picked up a heavy cube-shaped paperweight made of solid black marble. He spun it idly in his hand, the polished stone catching the light. Complications are for lesser men, Damien said softly. I do not tolerate them. I eliminate them, and I eliminate the people who create them. He stood up, not with anger, but with a slow, deliberate grace. He walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of the terrified subordinate. Give me your hand, Damien said. It was not a request. The man flinched as if struck. Mr. Blackwood, please. Your hand, Damien repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It was the most terrifying sound Isabella had ever heard. With a shaking limb that seemed disconnected from his body, the man extended his right hand, palm up. Damien looked at it for a moment, then placed the marble paperweight back on his desk. Isabella felt a brief, foolish flicker of relief. Then Damien took the man's hand in his own. He placed it flat on the surface of the desk. With his other hand, he calmly, methodically bent the man's fingers backward. He did it slowly, with an anatomist's precision, until a sickening, wet crack echoed in the silent room. The man let out a strangled, muffled scream, his body convulsing as he fell to his knees, clutching his ruined hand to his chest. Tears streamed down his face, a mixture of agony and pure terror. Isabella clapped her own hand over her mouth, her stomach churning violently. She felt bile rise in her throat. The sound of the break would be seared into her memory forever. But the most horrifying part was Damien. He looked down at the writhing man with no expression at all. There was no anger, no satisfaction, not even contempt. There was nothing. It was the detached look of someone correcting a minor error. He took a silk handkerchief from his pocket, wiped his own fingers, and then dropped the cloth onto the man's shoulder. You may go, Damien said, his voice returning to its normal, calm cadence. Send Dr. Evans a message. Tell him you had an accident. The man scrambled to his feet, still sobbing, and stumbled out of a side door without looking back. Damien watched him go, then turned and walked back to his desk as if nothing had happened. He sat down and picked up a pen. It was then that his eyes flickered towards the main door, towards the crack where Isabella was hiding. For a heart-stopping second, their eyes met. He didn't seem surprised. He simply gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement. Then he looked back down at his paperwork. Isabella pulled back as if burned. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. She ran. She didn't know where she was going, just away. She fled to her room and locked the door, leaning against it as her body shook uncontrollably. He knew. He knew she had been watching. And he didn't care. Maybe he had wanted her to see, to understand the kind of man he was, the man she had bound herself to. He was not just powerful. He was a monster who wore a perfectly tailored suit. The protector she had run to was capable of a cold, passionless cruelty that was far more terrifying than any heated rage. And he had just shown her, without a single word, that the same rules applied to everyone in his world, including her. For a week, Isabella lived in a state of suspended fear. She barely ate. She spoke only when spoken to. Every time Damien entered a room, she would flinch inside, though she fought to keep her expression neutral. He acted as if the incident in the study had never happened. He was as attentive and unnervingly gentle as ever. He would talk to her about art, about music, about the city lights below. It was a terrifying dissonance, like having a conversation with a tiger while knowing it had just made a kill. His calm was no longer a comfort. It was a threat. It was the placid surface of a deep, dark ocean, and she had just seen the monster that lurked in its depths. Her chance for an unsupervised moment came unexpectedly. A critical issue with one of Damien's overseas shipping ports required his immediate personal attention. He was gone before dawn, a rare occurrence. He told her he would be back by nightfall. He seemed reluctant to leave her, his dark eyes searching her face as if memorizing it. "Stay inside, Isabella," he had said, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You're safest here." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they felt like the closing of a lock. He left her in the care of his primary bodyguard, a stoic giant named Marcus who rarely spoke. For hours she paced the penthouse, the silence stretching her nerves thin. In the mid-afternoon, Marcus informed her that Mr. Blackwood had arranged for a curated selection of winter coats to be delivered for her approval. The delivery was being made to the building's private lobby. Protocol dictated that Marcus had to go down to receive and screen the package personally. He would be gone for 10 minutes at most. He told her to lock the penthouse door behind him and not to open it for anyone. For the first time in weeks, Isabella was truly alone. The silence was absolute. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the tiny figures of people on the streets below. They were free. They could walk wherever they wanted, meet whomever they chose. A tear slid down her cheek. She touched the cold glass, a barrier between her and a life that was no longer hers. A soft chime sounded from the private elevator that opened directly into the penthouse foyer. Isabella froze. Marcus had the key card. No one could come up without it. Her heart began to pound. She backed away from the foyer, her mind racing. Was it one of Damien's men, checking on her? The elevator doors slid open. It was not one of Damien's men. It was Ethan. She barely recognized him. The golden boy charm was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed desperation. He was gaunt, his expensive suit rumpled and stained. His blonde hair was unkempt, and a desperate, hunted look was in his eyes. He must have been watching the building for days, for weeks, learning the patterns, waiting for this one impossible sliver of an opportunity. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He took a step into the foyer, looking around the vast, sterile space with wide, terrified eyes. "Ethan, you can't be here," she said, her voice a choked whisper. "You have to leave, now." "Please," he said, taking another step toward her. He looked like a broken man. The arrogant bully who had humiliated her in front of hundreds of people was gone. In his place was a frightened child. "You have to help me. You have to call him off." "I can't," she said, shaking her head. The words felt like sandpaper in her throat. "I can't control him. He's doing this for you." Ethan's voice rose, cracking with hysteria. "Don't you see? It's all for you. Since that night at the wedding, he's been picking us apart piece by piece. My father had a heart attack last week, Izzy. He's in the hospital. My mother, she just sits in the dark. The company is in ruins. Our friends won't even take our calls. We're finished. He's destroyed us." He collapsed to his knees, his body shaking with sobs. He crawled the last few feet towards her and grabbed the hem of her dress, his face buried in the fabric. "Please, Isabella, I'm begging you. I am so sorry. For everything. I was a fool. I was cruel. I know that now. Just tell him it's enough. Tell him you've had your revenge. Tell him to stop." Isabella looked down at the top of his head, at his shaking shoulders. This was it. This was the scene she had played in her mind 100 times. Ethan Hayes at her feet, broken and begging. But there was no triumph. There was no satisfaction. There was only a profound soul-crushing sickness. The face of her revenge was pathetic and ugly. It was the wreckage of a human being. The weight of her own complicity pressed down on her, suffocating her. She had wished for this, and her wish had been granted by a devil who always collected his due. "Ethan, get up," she said softly, her voice trembling. She tried to pull her dress from his grasp, but he held on tighter. "Not until you promise," he wept. "Promise me you'll talk to him." Suddenly the elevator chimed again. Both of them froze. The door slid open and Marcus stood there, his face a mask of cold fury. He took in the scene in an instant. Isabella pale and shaken, and Ethan clinging to her like a drowning man. He moved with a speed that was terrifying for a man his size. He grabbed Ethan by the collar of his suit and hauled him to his feet as if he weighed nothing. "You should not be here," Marcus growled, his voice a low rumble. "No, wait," Isabella cried out. But it was too late. Marcus was already dragging the struggling, pleading Ethan back towards the elevator. "Tell him, Izzy, please," Ethan screamed, his voice echoing in the foyer as the steel doors slid shut, silencing him. Isabella stood alone in the vast, silent room, the echo of Ethan's desperate pleas ringing in her ears. The strength left her legs and she sank onto the cold marble floor, wrapping her arms around herself. She had done this. She had set this all in motion. The humiliation at the wedding felt like a lifetime ago, a petty hurt that had metastasized into this catastrophic ruin. She had wanted to teach a boy a lesson, and in the process, she had sold her soul to a monster. She put her head in her hands and wept. She cried for Ethan's broken family. She cried for the woman she used to be, and she cried for the prisoner she had become. She didn't know how long she sat there on the floor. Time had ceased to have meaning. She was startled by a soft touch on her shoulder, and she gasped, looking up with tear-filled eyes. Damien was kneeling in front of her. He must have returned, entering as silently as a ghost. His face was a study in calm concern. Marcus had obviously called him the second it happened. He knew. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and, with the pad of his thumb, gently wiped a tear from her cheek. His touch was warm, but it sent a shiver of ice through her entire body. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement, but he noticed. His eyes, dark and piercing, searched her face, reading the guilt and the horror that she couldn't hide. He saw the pity she felt for Ethan. He saw her regret. He leaned closer, his presence enveloping her, blocking out the rest of the world. His voice was a soft, hypnotic whisper, meant for her alone. "He's just a boy, Isabella," Damien whispered, his gaze holding hers, refusing to let her look away. He dismissed Ethan's entire existence, his pain, his family's ruin, with 4 simple words. He made him seem insignificant, a childish mistake. He moved his hand from her shoulder to her jaw, his fingers resting gently against her skin. The gesture was tender, possessive. He tilted her head up slightly, forcing her to meet his intense stare. "I am a man," he continued, the words a low vibration that she felt more than heard. It was a declaration, a stark contrast. A boy breaks your heart. A man breaks the boy. The terrifying logic of his world was laid bare. His thumb stroked her cheek one last time, a gesture of comfort that felt like the forging of a chain. He looked deep into her eyes, and she saw the absolute, unshakable certainty there, a chilling finality that sealed her fate. "And you are mine now." His words hung in the silent air of the penthouse long after he spoke them. "And you are mine now." It was not a promise, it was a statement of fact, a title deed to her very soul. In the days that followed, Isabella learned the true weight of that ownership. The cage, once gilded and spacious, began to shrink, its invisible walls pressing in on her, suffocating her with comfort. It started with her phone. One morning she reached for it on the marble bedside table, only to find it gone. In its place was a new device, a slim, black rectangle of glass and metal, cold and unfamiliar to the touch. It had no branding, no logos. It was utterly anonymous. Damien was sitting in a leather armchair by the window, watching the city wake up below. He didn't turn as she picked it up. "It's more secure," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "All of your contacts have been transferred. No one will be able to listen in. You're safe." Isabella's fingers tightened around the phone. Safe. The word felt like a lie. She scrolled through the contacts. Her sister Sarah was there. Her mother. Her father. But when she tried to open her photo gallery, it was empty. Years of memories, holidays, silly selfies with friends. All of it was just gone. A blank slate. She felt a wave of dizziness, a feeling of being erased. "Where are my pictures?" Her voice was a small, tight thing. "A fresh start, Isabella," Damien replied, finally turning his head. His dark eyes met hers, and there was no malice in them, only a chilling, absolute certainty. "We don't need to look back at things that no longer matter." He stood and walked over to her, taking the old space her phone used to occupy. He was a mountain of quiet power in his perfectly tailored suit. He gently took the new phone from her hand and showed her how it worked, his fingers brushing against hers. His touch was like ice, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. She wanted to pull away, to scream that those things did matter, that they were all she had left of herself, but the words caught in her throat, strangled by fear. She just nodded, her gaze fixed on the polished marble floor. Next came her clothes. She had never owned much of value, but her worn denim jacket, her collection of soft, faded band t-shirts, her comfortable sneakers, they were hers. They were the texture of her life before him. One afternoon, she opened the vast walk-in closet to find it transformed. Racks of new clothing had appeared. Silk blouses in deep emerald and sapphire, cashmere sweaters in charcoal gray, elegant black dresses that whispered of expense. Her old clothes were not thrown out, not at first. They were simply pushed to the very back, a huddled, colorful mass of rebellion in a sea of dark, luxurious fabrics. Damien watched her that evening as she dressed for a dinner he was hosting. She had chosen one of the new dresses, a simple sheath of dark blue silk. He walked up behind her as she stood before the mirror, his reflection appearing behind hers, a shadow enveloping her. "That color suits you," he murmured, his hands landing on her shoulders. He placed the black diamond necklace, her collar around her throat. The stone felt heavier than usual. "It brings out the fire in your eyes." She looked at her reflection. The woman staring back was a stranger. Her hair was styled perfectly. Her face was pale against the dark silk, and her eyes, as he said, held a spark. But it wasn't fire. It was terror. The next day, when she went to the closet, her old clothes were gone. Every last sweater, every pair of jeans. The space they had occupied was now filled with more designer boxes, unopened. She didn't cry. The feeling was deeper than tears, a hollow ache in her chest, as if a part of her had been surgically removed. She was becoming his creation, a doll he dressed and posed in his perfect, sterile world. Her isolation was absolute. She was never left alone. A quiet, stern woman named Maria came to cook and clean, but she never spoke unless spoken to, her eyes always downcast. The bodyguards were silent sentinels, always present but never intrusive, a constant reminder of her confinement. She would spend hours staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the tiny people in cars move below. They were free. They had lives messy and imperfect in their own. She had this beautiful prison and a man who believed he owned her. One night, a storm rolled in from the coast. It was a violent, angry tempest. Rain lashed against the giant panes of glass like thrown stones. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the entire building. The lights flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the penthouse into an abyss of darkness, broken only by the stark, terrifying flashes of lightning. Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She had always hated thunderstorms, a childish fear that clung to her from a long-ago night when lightning had struck a tree outside her bedroom window. In the sudden, oppressive blackness, the penthouse felt impossibly large and threatening. She felt a surge of pure panic, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. A flicker of lightning illuminated the room, and he was there. Damien. He was standing in the doorway to the living area, a silhouette against the raging sky. She hadn't heard him approach. "Are you afraid of the dark, Isabella?" he asked. His voice was calm, a strange anchor in the chaos of the storm. "No," she lied, her voice trembling. "The thunder. It's just loud." Another crack of thunder, louder this time, made her flinch violently. She couldn't stop it. In the next flash of lightning, he was closer. He had crossed the room in the dark without making a sound. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He was only a few feet away now. She could feel the heat radiating from him. "Everyone is afraid of something," and he said softly. He reached out, his hand finding her arm in the darkness. His grip was firm, grounding. It's a primitive response, the feeling of being powerless against a force you cannot control. Lightning flared again, and his face was inches from hers. His eyes were dark pools reflecting the storm outside. He wasn't looking at her with pity, but with a strange, intense understanding. It was frightening. He was the storm in her life, the force she could not control. I, she began, but the words died. Her fear of the storm was nothing compared to her fear of him, yet his presence was also the only solid thing in the swaying darkness. This thought horrified her. The twisted dependency she felt was a poison, seeping into her veins. I won't let anything happen to you, he whispered, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her inner arm. The touch was electric, a jolt that had nothing to do with the lightning. I won't fail again. Fail again? The words were odd, a crack in his perfect, controlled facade. For a split second, she saw not a monster, but a man haunted by something, a past loss that drove his obsession. The thought was dangerous. It made him human, and it was easier to hate a monster. He leaned in closer. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, mixed with the electric tang of ozone in the air. She thought he was going to kiss her. Her entire body went rigid. Her mind screamed no, but her body was frozen, caught between terror and a confusing magnetic pull. She closed her eyes, bracing for the impact. But it never came. Instead, his lips brushed against her temple, a touch so light it was barely there. It was more possessive than any kiss could have been. It was an act of branding. He lingered there for a heartbeat, his breath warm against her skin, before the lights flickered back on, flooding the room with sterile, artificial light. When she opened her eyes, he was already stepping back, his expression once again unreadable, controlled. The moment of vulnerability, if it had ever been there, was gone. The backup generator is on, he said, his voice back to its usual measured tone. You're safe. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, trembling. Her hand went to her temple, where the ghost of his touch still burned. She felt sick. The lines were blurring. He was her captor, her tormentor. But in that dark, stormy moment, he had also been her protector. The realization that a part of her had not pulled away, had been waiting, was the most terrifying thing of all. That night, Isabella decided she had to find a way out. The small, dangerous flicker of dependency she had felt during the storm scared her more than his anger. She knew that if she stayed, she would not just be his prisoner. She would become his accomplice, a willing participant in the destruction of her own soul. The first step was to reconnect with the world he had stolen from her. But to do that, she needed a weapon, a secret. She began to watch, to listen. She observed the routines of the penthouse with a new, desperate focus. Maria, the quiet cleaner, arrived at 9 every morning. She was always a little nervous around Damien, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her apron. She had a kind face etched with worry. Isabella saw a flicker of sympathy in the older woman's eyes one day, a brief, unguarded moment as she saw Isabella staring blankly out the window. The opportunity came a week later. Damien was in a series of meetings downtown, a rare occasion where he was physically absent for most of the day. The bodyguards were still there, of course, one by the front door, one in the main living area. Isabella took a small, delicate gold locket from her jewelry box, one of her grandmother's. It was one of the few pieces of her old life that had survived the purge, probably because he deemed it valuable enough. She found Maria dusting in the library. Isabella's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She glanced towards the door. The guard was out of sight. "Maria," she whispered. The woman jumped, startled. "Miss Isabella!" Isabella held out the locket. It lay small and bright in her trembling palm. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible. "I need a phone, a simple one he doesn't know about." Maria's eyes widened in fear. She shook her head, backing away. "No, miss, I can't. If he found out—" Her voice trailed off, but Isabella could imagine the consequences. "Please," Isabella repeated, pushing the locket into the woman's hand. "He's taken everything from me. My family thinks I'm happy. I just need to tell them I'm alive, that's all." The lie was easy, but the desperation behind it was real. Maria stared at the locket, then at Isabella's face. She saw the truth there, the silent scream behind her eyes. The older woman's expression softened with a terrible pity. She hesitated for a long moment, a silent battle waging in her eyes. Finally, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, quickly hiding the locket in her pocket. She scurried away without another word. 2 days passed. Isabella was consumed by anxiety. She was sure Maria had told him that any moment Damien would confront her, but he acted as if nothing had happened. Then on the third day, as Maria was leaving, she brushed past Isabella in the hallway. A small, hard object was pressed into Isabella's hand. She closed her fingers around it, her heart leaping into her throat. It was a cheap, plastic burner phone. Maria was gone before Isabella could even breathe a thank you. She hid the phone at the bottom of a planter, buried beneath the soil of a large fern in a corner of the sunroom that no one ever used. It was her secret, her hope, her one tiny piece of power in a world where she had none. The catalyst for her to finally use it came a few evenings later. She was reading in the library, a sprawling room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. It was the one place in the penthouse that felt almost warm, filled with the scent of old paper and leather. She had found a worn copy of an old favorite, and tucked inside was the one thing she had managed to save. A photograph. It was creased and faded at the edges. A picture of her and her family taken 2 summers ago. Her father had his arm around her mother, both of them laughing. Her sister Sarah was making a funny face at the camera, and Isabella was caught mid-laugh, her head thrown back, her eyes sparkling with genuine, uncomplicated joy. She looked so young, so free. She traced the outline of her sister's face with her finger, a wave of profound loss washing over her. "What is that?" The voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. Damien was standing in the doorway. In the doorway, she hadn't heard him enter. Her blood ran cold. She tried to slide the photo back into the book, but her hands were shaking too badly. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and plucked the photograph from her grasp. He held it up to the light, his expression unreadable. Isabella held her breath, her entire body rigid with dread. He stared at the photo for a long time. The silence stretched, becoming thin and sharp. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were no longer unreadable. They were filled with a terrifying glacial fury. It was not the hot, explosive anger she might have expected. It was something far worse. It was the cold, calm rage of absolute betrayal. "I gave you a new life," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I erased the pain. I destroyed the boy who hurt you. I gave you everything." He gestured around the opulent room. "And you hide this. You hold on to them." "They're my family," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I am your family now," he hissed, stepping closer. He wasn't shouting, but the intensity of his voice was more frightening than any yell. "This," he said, holding up the picture of her smiling face, "this girl is gone. I saved you from her weakness, from their world." He looked down at the smiling figures in the photo with utter contempt. "Why are you clinging to a ghost, Isabella? Why can't you be grateful?" He didn't understand. He truly believed he had done her a favor. He had not just imprisoned her body, he had expected her to surrender her memories, her history, her very heart. And her failure to do so was, in his eyes, the deepest form of ingratitude. He saw her love for her family as a betrayal of him. Without another word, he slowly, deliberately tore the photograph in half, then in half again. The sound of the ripping paper was like a scream in the silent room. He let the pieces flutter from his fingers to the floor. The image of her laughing family lay in tatters at his feet. He looked at her, his eyes black with a cold, possessive fire. "There. Now there is nothing to look back to. There is only me." He turned and left the library, leaving her standing there, surrounded by the ruins of her past. The tears she had been holding back finally came, silent, hot tracks down her face. It wasn't just a picture. He had torn up her identity. He had declared war on her soul. That night she knew she could not wait any longer. Every moment she stayed, she risked losing the fight, risked forgetting the girl in the photograph completely. She waited until the clock on the wall showed it was after 2 in the morning. The penthouse was submerged in a deep, artificial silence. She crept from her bed, her bare feet making no sound on the cold marble floor. She made her way to the sunroom, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She dug the burner phone from the planter, her fingers clumsy with haste and fear. She retreated to the cavernous master bathroom, the one place with a door she could lock, a flimsy illusion of privacy. She sat on the cold floor, the phone feeling like both a bomb and a lifeline in her hand. She dialed the number from memory, her sister's number. It rang once, twice. Her breath hitched. Hello? Sarah's voice, sleepy and confused, came through the tiny speaker. Sarah? Isabella choked out, the sound of her own voice a foreign, broken thing. Izzy? Is that you? What's wrong? Why are you calling from this number? Tears streamed down Isabella's face. Just hearing her sister's voice was like a drink of water after years in a desert. I can't talk for long, she whispered, pressing the phone harder against her ear. Listen to me. I'm not okay. Nothing is okay. What do you mean? Izzy, you sound terrified. Where are you? Is it him? Is Damien hurting you? It's not, it's not like that, she struggled to explain. How could she describe this cage? He's watching me. I can't leave. Sarah, you have to. She never finished the sentence. The handle of the bathroom door turned. It was locked. There was a soft click. The lock disengaged. The door swung open silently. Damien stood in the doorway. He was not looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the small, sleek phone he held in his own hand. On its screen, she could see an active call timer, mirroring the one on her burner phone. He was listening. He had been listening to the entire call. He slowly lifted his head and his eyes met hers. The cold rage from the library was gone. It had been replaced by something infinitely more terrifying, an expression of absolute glacial fury. It was the calm of a deep freeze, the stillness of a predator that knows its prey is finally irrevocably cornered. The silence was the worst part. It pressed in from all sides, heavier than any shout, colder than any threat. Damien stood in the doorway, the two halves of her cheap burner phone in his hand. He looked from the broken plastic to her face, his expression not one of rage, but of profound disappointment. It was the look a collector might give a priceless vase he had just found a crack in. He did not move for a full minute. The only sound was the distant, tinny voice of her sister, Sarah, still chirping from the speaker of his own phone, asking if she was there. Finally, he ended the call with a deliberate press of his thumb. He dropped the pieces of the burner phone onto the polished floor. They skittered and came to rest near her feet, a monument to her failed rebellion. You lied to me, Isabella, he said. His voice was unnervingly soft, a murmur that carried more menace than a roar ever could. He stepped into the room and she flinched back, her body hitting the cold glass of the window. He stopped a few feet away. I gave you a sanctuary. I gave you power, and you tried to crawl back to a life that no longer exists. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I wanted to hear her voice, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. I miss my family. I am your family now, he stated simply, as if explaining a law of physics. The rest was noise. I am silencing the noise for you. He did not touch her. He did not have to. His presence was a physical weight, suffocating her. Pack a bag, he said, turning toward the door. Just the clothes. Leave the jewelry. We are going away for a while, to a place where you will not be so tempted. The drive was silent. They left the glittering city lights behind, the car a black ghost gliding through sleeping suburbs and then onto dark country roads. Isabella stared out the window, watching the world she knew dissolve into an endless tapestry of trees and shadows. There were no tears left. A cold, terrifying calm had settled deep in her bones. She had provoked the monster, and now he was taking her into his den. The penthouse had been a cage, yes, but it was a cage overlooking a world she recognized. This was different. This was an exile. They arrived as the sun was beginning to stain the eastern sky with shades of gray and pale rose. A set of immense wrought iron gates swung open without a sound, and the car proceeded up a long, winding gravel driveway. The estate was breathtaking. A sprawling stone manor sat atop a gentle hill, surrounded by acres of perfectly manicured gardens and ancient, weeping willows. It looked like a painting, a dream of pastoral peace. But the dream was bordered by a high stone wall that seemed to go on forever, and she saw the glint of cameras mounted discreetly among the ivy. Inside, the house was furnished with an old-world elegance that felt even more oppressive than the penthouse's cold modernism. Dark wood paneling, thick carpets that swallowed every footstep, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors who watched her with vacant eyes. A quiet, uniformed staff moved like specters, their faces polite but impassive. Her room was in a secluded wing. It was beautiful, with a four-poster bed and a balcony overlooking a vast, misty forest. It was also a cell. The balcony door was locked. The windows did not open more than an inch. Damien was gone by noon. He had business in the city, a world she was no longer a part of. He left without a real goodbye, only a brief, chilling instruction to one of his guards. She is not to leave the grounds. She is to be kept comfortable, and she is to be watched. Always. The first week was a study in despair. She ate her meals alone in a cavernous dining room, the silence broken only by the clink of her fork against the china. She walked the gardens, always trailed at a distance by a silent guard. The beauty of the place felt like a mockery. The roses smelled sweet, but their thorns reminded her of the barbs on a wire fence. The sky was vast and open, but she was tethered to the ground. She was a ghost haunting someone else's perfect life. But despair is a luxury, and Isabella's had run out. On the 8th day, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, a constant low hum beneath the surface. But a new feeling was growing alongside it, a cold, sharp-edged resolve. She had been a victim. She had been a pawn. Now she would become a player. She stopped walking aimlessly and started observing. She learned the guards' shifts. There were 12 of them, working in teams of 4. Most were like the men from the city, hard-faced and detached, their eyes sweeping over her as if she were a piece of furniture. They were loyal to Damien, their futures tied to his fortune. They were impenetrable walls, but she was looking for a crack, not a door. And then she found him. His name, she learned from a fragment of overheard conversation, was Thomas. He was younger than the others, maybe 22 or 23. He had a boyish face that he tried to arrange into a mask of professional seriousness, but it never quite settled. His posture was not as rigid as the others. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he would rub the back of his neck, a small gesture of unease. He was the only one whose eyes did not slide over her. He would meet her gaze for a split second before looking away, a flicker of something she could not name in his expression. It was not pity. It was something closer to empathy. He was the weak link. Her new strategy began with a smile. It was a small, sad thing, offered as she passed him on the garden path. He was startled, giving a short, awkward nod in return. The next day, she stopped near the rose bushes where he was stationed. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" she said, her voice soft. He cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am." Damien always loved roses, she lied, the name feeling strange and metallic on her tongue. He once filled our entire apartment with white roses after we had a silly argument. He can be so intense, but his heart is good. She let out a small, wistful sigh and touched a velvety petal. She was building a character for him to see, the adored, slightly lonely lover, not the terrified prisoner. She had to make him believe she wanted to be here. She spoke to him in small doses over the next 2 weeks. She never talked about being trapped. She never complained. Instead, she painted a masterpiece of romantic fiction. She told him about a fictional first date, a walk along a moonlit beach. She described Damien not as a controller, but as a protector, a man so terrified of the dangers of the world that he built a fortress to keep his most precious treasure safe. "He lost someone a long time ago," she whispered to Thomas one afternoon, her voice thick with fake emotion. "He never talks about it, but I know it's why he worries so much. He just wants to keep me safe. Sometimes it's a little lonely, but I would rather be lonely and safe with him than be without him at all." She was playing the most important role of her life, and she found to her horror that she was a natural actress. The lies came easily, wrapped in the genuine sadness she felt for her own lost life. She was using her real pain to fuel a fiction. Thomas began to unbend. The man was dropped. He would ask her if she was warm enough. He once brought her a book of poetry he found in the library, leaving it on a bench for her. "I thought you might like this," he had mumbled, his cheeks coloring slightly. It was a small act of kindness, a tiny rebellion against the sterile protocol of the estate. And for Isabella, It was the key turning in the lock. Her plan for escape was born from a memory of a childhood birthday party. A girl named Chloe had accidentally eaten a cookie with peanut dust in it. Isabella remembered the girl's panicked gasps, the ugly red welts that appeared on her skin, the chaos as parents shouted and someone called for an ambulance. It was a terrifying memory, and it was perfect. She needed an allergen, and she needed to create an opportunity. She began paying close attention to the kitchen. Through a service window, she saw the chefs preparing desserts, crushing walnuts and almonds for cakes and pastries. She spent an afternoon in the garden, discreetly rubbing a leaf from a poison ivy vine she had identified on her inner arm until a faint red rash appeared. It was her dress rehearsal. She chose her moment carefully. It would be a Tuesday evening. Damien was in another country for a 3-day trip, a fact she'd carefully extracted from Thomas by asking when her love would be returning. Tuesday was also when a new supply truck made its delivery, a minor disruption to the estate's rigid security. Most importantly, Thomas would be on duty, stationed in the corridor outside her wing. That evening, she complained of a headache and asked for her dinner to be brought to her room. On the tray was a small slice of carrot cake, its cream cheese frosting sprinkled with crushed walnuts. Her heart began to pound a frantic, desperate rhythm. This was it. There was no turning back. She scraped a small amount of the frosting and nuts onto her finger. She did not eat it. She simply held it in her mouth, letting the oils coat her tongue, the taste acrid and foreign. Then she discreetly spit the contents into a napkin. She waited 10 minutes, her entire body trembling. She stood in front of the mirror, pinching her cheeks to make them flush, using the irritation from the leaf she'd saved to inflame the skin on her neck. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and then she began to scream. It was not a scream of terror, but a choked, gasping sound. She stumbled out of her room and into the hallway, clawing at her throat. "I can't breathe," she rasped, her voice a horrifying croak. Thomas was there in an instant, his face a mask of shock and alarm. "Isabella, what's wrong?" "The cake," she wheezed, pointing back at her room. "Nuts! I'm allergic." She let her knees buckle, collapsing against him. The rash on her neck was vivid and red. Her breaths were shallow, panicked pants. It was a terrifyingly convincing performance. Chaos erupted. Thomas yelled into his radio, his voice cracking. "Medical emergency! West Wing! Get a doctor now!" Another guard came running, his eyes wide. They were soldiers trained for firefights and intruders, not anaphylactic shock. They were out of their element, and they were panicking. They half-carried, half-dragged her down the hall toward the main staircase where they thought help would arrive faster. "The side door. Quicker!" Isabella gasped, pointing weakly toward a service corridor that led to the kitchens and a rear exit. It was a gamble, but they were not thinking clearly. They were focused only on saving the boss's girl. Thomas nodded frantically and directed the other guard. "Go! Through the kitchens!" They hustled her down the narrow, sterile corridor. The air smelled of bleach and old cooking oil. Through an open door, she could see the kitchen staff staring, frozen in shock. Thomas and the other guard were shouting at each other, one trying to administer aid while the other fumbled with his phone to call for an ambulance directly. This was her moment. The window of opportunity was only seconds long. As the second guard turned his back to scream into the phone and Thomas tried to lay her gently on the floor, Isabella gave a final convulsive shudder. Then, with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength she did not know she possessed, she scrambled to her feet. She shoved past a stunned Thomas and bolted for the heavy steel door at the end of the hall. It was a service exit, one she had seen staff use for smoke breaks. It was never guarded. She slammed the push bar with all her weight. The lock clicked open, and the door swung wide, revealing a cool, dark night. She did not hesitate. She did not look back. She plunged out into the darkness, her bare feet slapping against the cold gravel of a service path. Behind her, she heard a shocked shout, a moment of confused silence, and then a roar of fury. Isabella ran. She sprinted past dumpsters and manicured hedges, her lungs burning, her only guide the dark, looming silhouette of the forest ahead. She scrambled over a low decorative fence, tearing her silk pajamas. The forest floor was a tangle of roots and wet leaves, tripping her, scratching at her ankles. She kept going, driven by pure primal instinct. Then the sound she had been both dreading and praying for split the night open. A piercing electronic shriek. The alarm bells of the estate began to wail behind her, a symphony of her escape, a declaration of war. The forest floor was a trap of tangled roots and slick, decaying leaves. Every branch that whipped across Isabella's face felt like a deliberate strike. Every snap of a twig under her feet, a gunshot in the oppressive silence. The alarm bells from the estate were a frantic, shrieking pulse behind her, a sound that seemed to chase her, to cling to the back of her neck. Her lungs burned with a cold fire. She had no plan, no destination, only the primal instinct to put distance between herself and that gilded prison. She ran until the bells faded into the whisper of the wind, until her legs gave out and she collapsed against the rough bark of an oak tree, gasping for air that tasted of damp earth and freedom. But it was a tainted freedom, fragile and fleeting. She knew he was coming. Damien did not lose. She stumbled onto a deserted country road just before dawn, her clothes torn, her skin scratched and bleeding. A kindly trucker, seeing her distress, offered her a ride without asking too many questions. He dropped her at a bus station on the city's edge, a place that smelled of diesel fumes and desperation. The city skyline, once a symbol of dreams, now looked like the teeth of a saw. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. Every man in a dark suit made her heart hammer against her ribs. She was a ghost in her own city, hunted by the very power she had once sought as a shield. Her face was probably on 100 different security feeds by now, her name whispered into phones by men who obeyed Damien without question. He owned this city, and by extension, he owned every escape route within it. Isabella had no money, no phone, no identification. Her sister's apartment would be the first place he'd look. Her friends were liabilities, their lives too easily dismantled by a man like Damien. She was completely alone, an island of terror in a sea of oblivious people. She walked for hours, keeping to crowded streets where she might be overlooked, her mind racing. She needed to disappear, to become someone else, to get on a bus and never look back. But that required documents. It required money. It required a miracle. Or perhaps it required a devil she already knew. The thought was revolting. It rose in her throat like bile. But as she huddled in the back of a 24-hour library, pretending to read a newspaper, the idea took root. Who was the one person Damien would never expect her to contact? The one person who feared him just as much as she did? The pathetic, broken architect of her entire nightmare. Ethan. Finding a payphone that worked felt like a small victory. Her fingers were stiff with cold as she fed the last of the trucker's pity coins into the slot. She remembered the number. It was burned into her memory from 1,000 late-night calls in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The phone rang 3 times. She almost hung up. Then a voice answered, no longer smooth and confident, but ragged and suspicious. "Hello." "Ethan," she said, her own voice a stranger's whisper. There was a long silence on the other end, filled with the static of a poor connection. Then a sharp, panicked intake of breath. "Isabella, how did you... You can't call me. He'll know. He knows everything." "I'm not with him anymore," she said, the words feeling hollow. "I escaped." "You what?" The panic in his voice sharpened into pure terror. "Oh God, are you insane? He'll tear the city apart. He'll find you. He'll find me." "That's why you're going to help me," Isabella said, a cold resolve settling over her fear. "He's looking for me, Ethan. Not you. If I'm gone, truly gone, maybe his attention will move on. Maybe he'll finally leave you alone." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Help you? After everything? He destroyed me because of you." "He destroyed you because you couldn't stand to see a woman walk away," she corrected him, her voice gaining a sharp edge. "You did this, Ethan. You started this. You pointed me toward him at that wedding. Now you have a choice. You can help me disappear, and maybe, just maybe, save what's left of your own skin. Or you can do nothing and wait for Damien to find me. And when he does, do you really think he'll forget about the man who set it all in motion?" The silence on the line stretched for a full minute. She could hear his unsteady breathing, the sound of a man trapped in a cage of his own making. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice defeated. "A new name, an ID, enough cash for a bus ticket to somewhere far away. You used to know people who could arrange things like that." "Those people don't talk to me anymore," he muttered. "My accounts are frozen. I'm a pariah." "Find a way," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You owe me this, Ethan. You owe me a chance to get my life back. The life you took from me." He was quiet for another long moment. "There's an old warehouse district by the docks. Pier 4, Building 7. Be there tomorrow night, 9 o'clock. Don't be late and come alone. If I see anyone who even looks like they work for him, I'm gone." He hung up without another word. Isabella leaned her forehead against the cold, graffiti-scarred metal of the payphone booth. She had made a deal with her first monster to escape the second. She wasn't sure if it was a step toward freedom or just a deeper circle of hell. The next 36 hours were a blur of cold and hunger. She slept in the back of an all-night movie theater, the explosions and dialogue on screen a welcome distraction from the screaming in her own head. She ate a stale pastry someone had left behind. All the while, the feeling of being watched never left her. She saw Damien's face in her mind's eye, not angry, but wounded, possessive. It was the look of a collector who had discovered his most prized possession was missing from its case. The thought made her skin crawl. The warehouse district was a graveyard of industry. Rusted metal skeletons loomed against a bruised purple sky. The air was thick with the smell of salt, rust, and decay. Building 7 was a hulking brick structure with shattered windows like vacant eyes. The main sliding door was open just a crack, spilling a sliver of weak yellow light into the gloom. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This could be a trap. Ethan could have called Damien. He could be leading her right back to her cage. But what choice did she have? She slipped through the opening. The inside of the warehouse was vast and cavernous, filled with stacks of rotting crates and forgotten machinery shrouded in dusty tarps. Light from the high, grimy windows cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and shift. Every drip of water from the leaking roof, every creak of the old building settling, sounded like a footstep behind her. She moved toward the center of the open floor, a small, fragile figure in an enormous, decaying space. A few minutes later, a figure detached itself from the deep shadows near the far wall. It was Ethan. He looked even worse than he had sounded on the phone. His expensive coat was stained. His face was pale and unshaven, and his eyes darted nervously around the empty space. He clutched a thick manila envelope to his chest like a shield. "You came," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Did you think I wouldn't?" she replied, keeping her distance. "I thought he might have found you already," Ethan admitted, his gaze flicking toward the entrance. "Here," he held out the envelope. "It's all I could get. The ID is decent. There's $2,000 in bus ticket for a route that leaves at midnight. It goes west. Just keep going." Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. This was it. The key. The way out. For a single, breathtaking second, she felt a wave of impossible relief wash over her. It was almost over. And then she heard it. It was not a loud noise. It was a soft, deliberate click from the darkness outside. The sound of a luxury car door closing with perfect engineering. Both she and Ethan froze. His face went slack with a primal animal terror. His eyes widened, fixed on the narrow opening of the warehouse door. Slowly, the massive metal door began to slide open, not with a rusty shriek, but with a smooth, powered hum. It moved with an unnatural quietness, flooding the dark space with the piercing white glare of headlights. Two figures were silhouetted against the light. One was a large, imposing shape she recognized as one of Damien's bodyguards. The other was slender, impossibly still, and wore a perfectly tailored suit. "Damien," he stepped into the warehouse and the door slid shut behind him, plunging the space back into a dim, dusty twilight. He didn't rush. He moved with the unhurried grace of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. The air grew thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. Ethan made a small, strangled sound, like a dying animal. But Damien didn't even look at him. His eyes, dark and filled with a pain so deep it was terrifying, were fixed only on Isabella. He stopped about 20 feet away from her, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He looked at the torn fabric of her dress, The scratches on her arms, the exhaustion etched onto her face. A flicker of something that might have been regret crossed his features before being replaced by that familiar, chilling possessiveness. "Isabella," he said. His voice was not loud. It was a low, soft murmur, but it filled the entire cavernous space. It was the voice that had haunted her dreams, the voice that promised safety and delivered a cage. Ethan, finally finding his feet, took a stumbling step backward. "I didn't. She called me. I was just—" he stammered, his words dissolving into panicked gibberish. Damien's gaze did not waver from Isabella. It was as if Ethan was not even there, a piece of furniture, an irrelevant detail in the room. This was between the two of them. It had always been between the two of them. "You're hurt," Damien stated, his voice laced with a strange, quiet sorrow. "I would never have hurt you." "You locked me up," Isabella said, her voice shaking but clear. The envelope from Ethan felt impossibly heavy in her hand. "You tried to erase me." "I tried to protect you," he countered, taking a slow step forward. "From him, from them, from a world that would have torn you apart, the world that did this to you." He gestured vaguely at her disheveled state. "This is what freedom looks like," she shot back, clutching the envelope tighter. "It's messy and it's hard, but it's mine." A sad, thin smile touched his lips. "It's an illusion. There is no freedom. There is only strength and weakness. I offered you strength." He took another step. From the corner of his eye, Ethan saw his chance. He bolted, scrambling toward a side exit, his pathetic attempt at escape a clumsy, noisy disaster. Damien didn't turn. He didn't even flinch. There was a blur of motion from the bodyguard at the door, but Damien raised a single hand, a quiet, absolute command. "Let him go." But Ethan didn't get far. He tripped over a loose cable and went sprawling to the dirty concrete floor. He lay there whimpering, too terrified to even get up. Damien's attention remained entirely on Isabella. He was close now, so close she could smell the faint, expensive scent of his cologne, a scent that now made her feel nauseous. He slowly raised his right hand. In it, he held a sleek, black handgun. He wasn't pointing it, he was just holding it, letting the weight of it settle in the space between them. Ethan saw the weapon and let out a choked sob. "Please, don't," he begged from the floor. Damien ignored him. He looked deep into Isabella's eyes, his own expression a devastating mix of love, obsession, and utter despair. He spoke softly, his voice a caress that cut deeper than any blade. "Come back to me, Isabella," he said. "Come back to the penthouse. Let me take care of you. Come back to me, and he lives." She stared at him, her mind unable to process the ultimatum. Her silence was his answer. His expression hardened, the last glimmer of softness vanishing. "Refuse," he whispered, the sound barely audible. He then moved the gun, but he didn't point it at the pathetic, crying form of Ethan on the floor. He didn't even point it at her. With a steady, deliberate motion, he pressed the cold, metal muzzle of the gun firmly against his own chest, directly over his heart. "And we die together." The cold metal of the gun was pressed firmly against Damien's own chest. His words hung in the vast, dusty air of the warehouse, a promise and a threat wrapped in one. "Refuse, Buck, and we die together." The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling swung almost imperceptibly, casting long, dancing shadows that made the scene feel unreal. Ethan was a statue of pure terror beside her, his breath coming in ragged, silent gasps. But Isabella's eyes were locked on Damien. She saw past the impeccable suit, past the cold fury in his gaze. She saw a man holding a weapon to the only thing he truly feared losing. Himself. Her own heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was not a scream. It was a whisper that cut through the tension like glass. "No." It was not a word of defiance, it was a statement of fact, a rejection of his entire premise. Damien's finger tightened on the trigger. A minute, almost invisible movement. His jaw was a hard line of granite. "There is no other way, Isabella. You belong with me." Isabella took a small step forward. Ethan made a choked sound, a plea for her to stop, but she ignored it. She was no longer speaking to the broken boy cowering in the corner, nor to the police she hoped were listening. She was speaking only to the man in front of her, the architect of her gilded cage. "You think this is protection?" she asked, her voice gaining a quiet strength. "You think locking me away, controlling my every move, is how you keep someone safe?" His eyes, dark and bottomless, held hers. "I will not fail again." The words were low, torn from a place deep inside him she had only ever glimpsed. It was a confession. It was the key. She knew from a stray comment he'd once made in the dead of night, from a name she'd overheard his security chief mention in a hushed tone, a name from his past. Her name was Amelia, wasn't it? Isabella said softly. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. For the first time since she had met him, Damian Blackwood's mask of absolute control shattered. It was not a grand explosion, but a quiet, devastating implosion. The gun wavered in his hand. A flicker of unbearable pain crossed his face, so raw and exposed it made Isabella's chest ache. He looked for just a second like a lost boy, haunted by a ghost she had just given a name. "You don't know anything," he breathed. But the conviction was gone. His voice was hollow. "I know you lost her," Isabella continued, pressing into that hairline fracture in his soul. "I know you couldn't protect her, and I know you have spent every day since trying to build walls high enough to keep anything you care about from ever getting hurt again." A tear slid down her cheek, hot against her cold skin. "But Damien, I am not a fortress. I am a person, and you are not protecting me. You are burying me alive next to her." He stared at her, the gun still pointed at his heart, but his focus was gone. He was seeing a different face, hearing a different voice from a lifetime ago. He was trapped in a memory she had unlocked. This was it. This was the moment. Her eyes darted to Ethan, a sharp, clear signal. It was a look that said everything they had planned in hushed, terrified whispers. "It's over. Do it now," Ethan, jolted from his paralysis by her glance, fumbled with the phone in his trembling hand. His thumb swiped across the screen, hitting the green call button that connected him to the detective waiting just a few blocks away. He didn't even have to speak. The open line was the signal. The world outside the warehouse was about to come crashing in. For another 3 seconds, there was only the sound of Damien's unsteady breathing and the drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere in the darkness. He was still lost, his dark eyes clouded with a past he could never escape. Then the night erupted. The distant wail of sirens grew into a deafening roar. Blue and red lights flashed through the grimy windows, painting the interior in strobing, frantic colors. Heavy boots pounded on the asphalt outside. "Police, drop your weapon!" A voice boomed through a megaphone, the sound distorted and godlike. The spell was broken. Damien's head snapped up, his eyes clearing with the realization of what was happening. He looked from the flashing lights back to Isabella, a storm of betrayal and agony on his face. He had been played. She had used his deepest wound against him. But there was no time for words. The warehouse doors burst open, splintering as a battering ram smashed through the rusted lock. A flood of dark-clad officers swarmed in, weapons raised, laser sights dancing like red fireflies across Damien's chest. "Drop it! Now!" they screamed. Damien didn't move. He simply looked at Isabella, his expression unreadable. Was it hatred? Was it despair? In that final chaotic moment, she saw only a devastating sense of loss. He slowly, deliberately lowered the gun. But as he did, he angled it slightly. A single shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. Isabella flinched, a scream catching in her throat. It wasn't pointed at her or at the police. Damien crumpled to the ground, clutching his own shoulder, a dark stain spreading across the white fabric of his shirt. He had chosen injury over surrender, a final, defiant act of control. Officers swarmed him, securing the weapon, cuffing his hands behind his back as he gritted his teeth in pain. Paramedics rushed in. The scene was a blur of motion and shouting. A detective gently took Isabella's arm, trying to lead her away. "Miss, are you all right? We need to get you out of here." But she stood frozen, watching as they lifted Damien onto a stretcher. His eyes found hers one last time through the chaos. There was no anger left in them, only a hollow, echoing emptiness. As the detective guided her toward the exit, past the broken doors and into the cold, crisp night air, Isabella's hand went to her throat. Her fingers closed around the black diamond. The weight of it, the cold, smooth feel of it against her skin, was a physical manifestation of her captivity. It was his mark, his claim. With a sudden, violent tug, she ripped the necklace from her neck. The delicate platinum chain snapped. She didn't even look at it. She walked over to a grimy, oil-slicked puddle reflecting the flashing police lights and opened her hand. The black diamond, a stone that absorbed all light and held a dark heart, fell without a sound. It vanished into the murky water, swallowed by the filth of the warehouse floor. She didn't look back. She just kept walking, breathing in the free, cold air of the night. 6 months later, the ocean was a constant, soothing whisper outside the window. The town was small, a place where people came to disappear or to start over. Isabella Rossi was gone. In her place was Anna, a quiet woman with haunted eyes who worked at a small bookstore called the Salty Page. The smell of old paper and binding glue was her new perfume. The rustle of turning pages was her new soundtrack. She had found a fragile peace in the anonymity, in the simple, predictable rhythm of her days. Stacking books, making coffee for the few daily customers, and walking along the beach as the sun went down. She was healing, but she was not whole. Some nights, she still woke up with her heart pounding, the phantom weight of the necklace at her throat. The memory of Damien's penthouse, a beautiful prison in the sky, was a scar on her mind. She had testified. His trial was a media circus she'd observed from a distance through a lawyer who protected her new identity. He was convicted, sentenced to years in a place where his power and money meant something, but not everything. He was caged just as he had caged her. She told herself it was over. She repeated it like a mantra every morning when she looked in the mirror at the face that was hers again. One Tuesday afternoon, the bell above the bookstore door chimed. A delivery man stood there holding a long, slender black box. "For Anna," he said, checking his device. She signed for it, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She didn't get deliveries. She didn't really know anyone here well enough to receive a gift. She placed the box on the worn wooden counter, her hands hesitating. It was elegant, wrapped in simple black paper with a silver ribbon. Too elegant for this quiet little town. With trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of black tissue paper, was a single, perfect black rose. Its petals were like velvet, the color of a moonless midnight. It was beautiful and deeply, terribly wrong. There was no card, no note. There didn't need to be one. She knew who it was from. It was his signature, a symbol of dark, obsessive beauty, a promise he had once whispered to her that he would always find her. She stood there in the quiet sanctuary of her new life, holding the impossible flower. The scent of the sea mixed with the faint funereal perfume of the rose. For a moment, the old fear washed over her, cold and absolute. The shadow was long. It could stretch across states, across walls of steel and stone. He was out, or he had a reach that prison could not contain. She closed her eyes, feeling the floor beneath her feet, the solid wood of the counter under her hands. She was not the same girl who had walked into the Grand Astoria Hotel ballroom. She was not the same woman who had trembled in his penthouse. When she opened her eyes again, the fear was still there. It was a cold ember in the pit of her stomach. But now it was mixed with something else, something hard and unyielding. A resolve forged in fire and desperation. She was free. She had earned that freedom with her own courage and her own wits. He could send his ghosts. He could send his shadows. She would not run again. She looked down at the black rose, a symbol of his undying obsession, and a quiet strength settled over her. She would live her life, and if his shadow ever fell across her path again, she would be ready. What would you have done? One line in the comments. Let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.